The Transatlantic slave trade, one of the most horrific events in human history, saw the forcible removal of millions of Africans from their homes and transferred to the Americas. But for many, they took a piece of home with them in the form of memory, knowledge, and even food. Today, we'll look at the role of produce in the transatlantic slave trade. Our awareness of Africa begins as the place where our hominid ancestors evolved, but it remains a dark continent in terms of broader understanding of what African peoples accomplished in the millennia preceding the transatlantic slave trade, when the continent's history again becomes into focus for modern audiences. Unexamined views of Africa carried the presumption of a continent on the sidelines of world history, where little occurred until the Atlantic slave trade swept away millions of its people. In the New World, so these views maintain, Europeans taught their unskilled bondsmen to plant crops and tend animals. Nevertheless, one of the remarkable achievements of Africans over the past 10,000 years was the independent domestication of plants and animals for food. These African species journeyed to Asia in the second and first millennia BCE, and later profoundly shaped the food systems of plantation societies of the Americas. And Patrick, that was the opening of the first chapter of Judith Carney's In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. And what you might have gained from that passage is that we're going to be talking about the transatlantic slave trade and obviously the role that fresh produce had to play in that in honor of Black History Month. It's February here, and obviously Black History Month is the celebratory period of February in the United States, as well as actually Canada and Germany. There are other countries that celebrate Black History Month, but they do it at other times of the year. So like Ireland, Holland, UK, they celebrate in October. But it's an important holiday to acknowledge, at least for
100%.
especially us in America that have been so impacted by that momentous period in history that really spans a few centuries, that really shaped this country and the food. And more particularly when we look at food more narrowly, produce. And it's really not something that a lot of people think about every day. And especially in our industry, I don't think it's something
Agreed.
that's really discussed or even aware of. And I understand, we are two white guys talking about this, but when I was thinking more about it, I said, you know what? I think it's important that two white guys also talk about this and acknowledge it and share that message, because I know personally it's not a story that we hear a lot. Yes, we learn in school about slavery and, to me, it's very surface level things. Okay, so many people got moved over here. They were enslaved, horrible life, all these things. But you really don't get into the meat of what these people went through, the impact it had on an emotional level, a cultural level, and then the impacts that it had on a wide range of things within America. And we're going to try to go through that today in a single episode, which are probably not doing it enough justice, but it's,
definitely not enough justice. And, it's as crazy as it sounds, John, my connection, obviously, with the African American community. I grew up right with the African American community, these flavors of their meals, right? All types of things. And, it's like people want to joke about it, but it's so crazy because I tell this story all the time, is that, where I went to middle school and high school, we lived in this little town called Mount Dora, Florida. And diversification was key. Right there was African Americans, there was Hispanics, right? And then I always say, there was Caucasians, the white people, but when we were growing up, my family, my dad is an immigrant, and he would always say, we're all the same people, right? And that was one thing. So it's like I have been able to experience all of these cool flavors, and then even going back watching High on Hog is a documentary on Netflix that you and I have been, talking about. it was so funny because I was watching that show. I was like, oh my gosh, like yes, 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 and some of those things that they spoke about, the flavors, right, the spices, how they created their culinary cuisine, right, is just based on some of these things that go all the way back, that dated back to them being enslaved, right? And that's what's so crazy about it. People say like the black eyed peas, right? Like
Yep.
that was a staple items when African Americans were enslaved, right? There was so much. And then now to this day, black eyed peas are made in a lot of culinary dishes.
Yeah.
Even from the West African dishes all the way just to, traditional African dishes here in America. So, it's one thing. It's so funny because my son, it's again, you say two white guys, and then we say this so openly, but my son's best friend, right, is African American. Shout out to you, Chase. We love you, buddy. And then the same with me growing up. My two greatest friends, right? Right, a Korean, which you've met, which is Jahoon,
of course. Yeah.
and then Welton Nance, African American, and then David Rodriguez, Hispanic. So as I grew up, I got to be exposed, and that's my lifestyle, man. That's what I know. That's what I live. So I am glad we were talking about this and bringing the cuisine to our channel.
Absolutely. And I've been actually very excited about sharing these stories. This is just part one, I will call it, of our episodes for this month. And this month is all focusing or themed around Black History Month. And we're going to be teasing what some of those other topics are going to be. But today we're going to focus on the transatlantic slave trade because that's really the beginning point.
Yep.
As it relates to us in America and our relationship with this culture that comes here.
I hope I didn't ramble on either. I thought that was a good,
I think it's
prelude to the to this episode too.
Absolutely. So I think we should start in Africa, just to give a little bit of an idea to people what African culture looked like before the whole slave trade began, what the continent is like. So for those of you who are not geographically inclined or not big geography fans, I'm going to keep it really simple, but Africa is really a land of extraordinary size and diversity. Okay. So it covers over 30 million square kilometers. And to put it in perspective, if you're kind of laying Africa over different continents, it's 3 times the size of Europe and even larger than North America. So if you look at North America, Africa spans a distance equal to the journey from New York to Hawaii. So it's massive.
It's amazing.
And beyond its scale, Africa is the birthplace of agricultural innovation and just this legacy that has shaped global food systems around the world for over 10,000 years.
John, and what's crazy is let's really start with the astonishing facts, right? If you look at Africa is a home, right? And it's a home to over 2,000 native grains. Okay. That means roots, tubers, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and oil crops. So the process of domestication here, as elsewhere, was deliberate and transformative. African communities carefully selected wild plants with traits that met their needs: larger size, higher yield, controlled ripening, taste, and ease of processing. John, like how crazy is that?
Yeah.
I mean,
just like we said, everywhere. That's what we've been talking about in many episodes that we've done so far.
Exactly. So let's get into this a little more. So some of these crops have become staple across the globe. Think of pearl millet, sorghum, coffee, watermelon, okra, and black-eyed peas. See, even the kola nut, palm oil, tamarind, and hibiscus trace their origins to the fertile land. Africa's contributions to global food supplies exceed 100 species, an extraordinary gift to the world, right? This is a gift to us.
Exactly.
Now, there is a misconception that persists. Too often, Africa is depicted as a land of scarcity. It's very true. We do think of that, right? And I've heard that many times.
Yeah, in the news, it's always they're going hungry and there's nothing to eat, and yeah.
And again, we do know there are countries that do need help, right? We do know that.
Of course.
But historical accounts tell a very different story. By the time Europeans began exploring Africa's west coast in the 15th century, they were struck by its agricultural abundance, John. So one 17th century trader, Lemos Colho, marveled at the bounty he encountered. Okay, so let's read this. The blacks have many foodstuffs, such as guinea hens, husked rice, all quality and cheap, plenty of milk, and excellent fat, mantinga butter. Now, this is because the whole kingdom of Nani is full of villages of fulos who have these foodstuffs in abundance, John. A cow costs only a pataka or its equivalent. Thus, everything necessary for human existence is found in this land and in great plenty of sumptuousness. And John, before I keep going on, as I did watch like the High on the Hog, that was one of the things that they talked about was that mantiga, the butter, what they use. And one of those things that they use, because a lot of people think when you make like fried chicken, what you use, there's a certain aspect of milk, butter, what you use. Traditionally, Americans will use a completely different recipe to make fried chicken than the African American community, especially in the heart of the South and Louisiana. Okay. So as we keep moving through this and talking about it, even during the devastating transatlantic slave trade, which removed millions of people from the continent, African societies continued to produce food surpluses. And let's not forget, Africa's early influence on agriculture became beyond its borders too. So sorghum, for instance, transformed food systems in semi-arid India, so providing a resilient grain suited to the region's climate. The timeline of African culture or agriculture innovation stretches back thousands of years, by 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, John. So sorghum was cultivated in what is now Sudan. Evidence, though, does suggest, the domestication of cotton near Khartoum by 5000 BCE, while polished stone axes found in West Africa rainforests hint at yam cultivation as early as 4000 BCE. John, it is remarkable. That is, well, one, it's remarkable and it's humbling to consider how Africa's early ag advancements shaped the world. Despite the gaps in archaeological research, evidence from the archaeobotany and the linguistics suggest that plant cultivation on the Africa continent is even older than we even imagine, John. So that's
really stunning,
right? And I think that is what's so amazing. And everyone, please, we're not like promoting this heavily, but that High on the Hog Netflix documentary, as we did this research and then watching the documentary, oh my gosh, it shows. I always say how crazy this is. It shows how elegant and educated and smart the Africans were, with a lot more than what they were perceived thousands of years ago.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, these were not dumb people. These were highly intellectual people. And we're going to get on that. I mean, the amount of knowledge that they brought over to the Americas on agriculture and obviously a number of other things, but we're focused on agriculture is immense. And we're going to see how impactful and significant that was, not just to themselves, but to their captors.
Well, it's even funnier too, John, is like, and you talk about soul food. They say that African Americans have soul food. And, obviously with doing a lot of this research, knowing it's because they put their heart and soul into it. And when some of these, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, right? Right. But even like being enslaved, they were only able to eat certain foods that they were given. And when they took these foods, they put their heart and soul into creating spices and different ways of cooking it. So when they talk about, I say they, African Americans, when they talk about the soul food, because they put their passion into it, they put their love into it, they put everything they had into creating a meal that surrounds a great dinner table.
Yeah. No, it's true. And when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and we touched on this at the very beginning when we're discussing the concept, food might not be the first thing that comes to mind, but the truth is African food systems were the backbone of this immensely brutal enterprise, feeding everyone involved, willingly or not, from the point of capture all the way to the horrific Middle Passage. So let's dissect that a little bit. So first, you had the African militias and the raiders who took slaves that had to be fed. Likewise, so did the Africans who awaited deportation to the New World. Then you had the resident slave traders and European officials that are stationed at these forts along the Guinea coast that also depended on food availability. And finally, you had the slave ships that carried the Africans on this Atlantic crossing that required provisions enough for journeys that lasted 2 and a lot of times more months than that. So food is a critical piece of this whole, like I said, enterprise. And it's important to remember too that when these slave ships docked along the African coast, they weren't fully stocked with provisions. And so most of the food that sustained the enslaved people on those voyages were grown and sourced locally in Africa. You had staples like you briefly touched on at the beginning, Patrick. You had staples like millet, rice, yams, plantains, sorghum. These were all pivotal, and not just for the survival of the captives, but the entire system of this human exploitation. So European traders source these foods in a variety of ways, right? So slave ship captains might buy supplies from European or Euro African traders stationed at coastal forts, or directly from African merchants in areas known for reliable food production. But these transactions, again, were not just about sustaining voyages, they also fueled the local economies, of course, under deeply exploitative circumstances. Um, but but there was challenges that came along with that, of course. So by the late 1500s,
Always challenges, right,
always
John?
challenges, especially
Always
when you're talking
challenges.
about this immense amount of people to feed. I mean, we see that in modern day. There's challenges with food. So by the late 1500s, there's this massive displacement of people from the African interior to the coastal ports. And that's just having this devastating effect on food availability. So you have rural labor forces who are usually young, able bodied people that are being depleted. And that is disrupting, of course, the agricultural production within that region, so the interior of Africa. Meanwhile, the demand for food at these coastal ports that are holding these captives and these traders and all these things, they they're needing sustenance too. So there's this imbalance that is constantly leading to these chronic threats of food shortages. So how does this get handled? So one thing that happens is the Portuguese merchants, and they were one of the more prominent merchants, European merchants in this region at that period in time, the 1500s. They were not just operating in Africa; they were operating in Brazil as well. And from Brazil, they made sure to bring their own subsistence crops, specifically manioc. And in Brazil, Portuguese merchants produced these massive quantities of manioc flour. And the flour was produced by Amerindians who are made to grate and process it from these vast numbers of manioc tubers. And again, so there's also slavery on the other side, right? These captive indigenous peoples of the Americas. And then by the early 1600s, an estimated 680 tons of this manioc flour was being exported annually to Angola. And the reason specifically for manioc is it was just this ideal flour for the harsh conditions of the trade. It was calorie dense, it was resistant to spoilage, it was easy to store. And so over time, African agricultural systems actually adopted this tuber, incorporating it alongside their traditional staples like plantains, beans, and sorghum. And these adaptations, again, were not just about survival, they were about meeting these relentless demands of the slave trade. So you have, again, uh, this transportation, this movement of foods from different continents, in this particular case, from the Americas to Africa. And eventually, you actually have specialized agricultural estates that are emerging along the African coast that are focusing on producing manioc in addition to a lot of other Amerindian crops like maize, like sweet potatoes, alongside, again, their traditional staples. And we've talked a little bit about maize before, and we're going to talk about it again a little bit here again. Uh, And you even had captured slaves that were made to labor in these agricultural estates to produce crops that would ironically ultimately feed them and their fellow captives. And this is because slaves taken in the interior could only be shipped downstream during 3 months of high river water. And if they arrived at the coast during the rainy season, when the slave ships were less frequent and just not around as much, they most certainly couldn't be left idle, right? They had to do something according to their captors, and so they would work on these agricultural estates, producing these foods that would fuel the slave ships going into America. Now, I mentioned maize. Let me come back to that real fast because that's an important thing to remind everybody about, because this is another transformative crop brought to Africa through the Columbian exchange, just like the manioc I just described. And maize, again, is this high yielding, it's a hot, fast growing plant that just makes it invaluable for feeding the enslaved people and supporting this trade's logistical needs. But like a lot of these Amerindian crops that come over, there's a dark irony here, right? Maize's success in Africa is deeply intertwined with the dehumanization of the very people it was used to feed. So while maize revolutionized African agriculture, it also symbolized the erasure of autonomy for those captured and enslaved. So, dietary choices were just stripped away and replaced with food that's designed solely to sustain this human cargo during their forced journey to the Americas. So it's really a stark reminder that even the food systems of the time were reshaped by the violence and the exploitation of the slave trade. And so as rural communities tried to protect themselves from slave raiders, peasants would pay tribute to elites offering military protection in the form of surplus grain, cattle, other foodstuffs. Yet this ultimately weakened the position of these independent agricultural producers because it forced them to surrender a significant portion of what they produced.
And isn't it amazing too, John, that how I love how maize comes back up again. Maize is
It's
such a
always
it's a
rears
such a
back its head.
staple item, man.
Yeah.
And it so is. And that's a crucial point. We often heard the transatlantic trade coined as the triangle trade,
Yeah,
right, John?
that's
So
right.
a
Yeah.
system where Europeans sold firearms, iron bars, spirits, textiles, and beads in Africa in order to purchase slaves. So slaves were then carried from Africa to the New World, and from the Americas, the commodities produced by enslaved labor were transported to Europe. But it wasn't just about cash crops like sugar, coffee, or tobacco, John. Okay. This entire enterprise was sustained by food grown, traded, and consumed at every step. This is a piece of the narrative that is often missing because without food, the enslaved Africans would have not survived and the system simply would have just collapsed, John.
Yeah. I mean, we say it time and time again on this podcast, right?
Mhm.
Food is everything. Food is something that we all have to
Food and
survive.
water.
And especially in a brutal, exploitative, just horrendous trade system that's developed here in the trade of essentially human cargo, food is the is the most critical resource to fuel this whole thing. So why don't we
100%.
take a break here? And when we return, we'll find out what happens when these enslaved African people arrive in the Americas. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the History of Fresh Produce. Before break, we finished really painting a scene, Patrick, of what the the transatlantic slave trade meant for the African continent in terms
Yes.
of food, specifically plant-based crops, and how that impacted societies in Africa. And now we're going to turn our attention to America for the rest of the episode, kind of painting what the other side of that journey looked like and the legacy that's left behind. And it's really easy to think of America as a land shaped by European immigration. That's very much kind of the forefront message I feel like we still get to some level in this country, in America. But let's not forget a staggering fact, okay? until the 1820s, the majority of all immigrants to the Americas, not just North America, but the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, were actually born in Africa. 3 out of every 4 people who crossed the Atlantic before the 19th century were forcibly taken from Africa, not Europe. And over 40% of them actually arrived in Brazil. And
Wow.
so I want to share those numbers because these numbers just really highlight just how deeply the African diaspora influenced the Americas.
Well, John, it wasn't just the people, okay? It was their cultures, their knowledge, and yes, their food, right? So as we talk about and keep moving through this, right? Most of these individuals came from tropical Africa and were disembarked into environments that in many ways resembled their homelands. They found vegetation from familiar plant families whose potential food and medicinal properties awaited their discovery. The tropics of the New World also offered microenvironments suitable for growing the crops they were familiar with: yams, plantains, millet, sorghum, rice, and beans. These staples didn't just survive with, I would say, they didn't just survive with the transatlantic journey, John. They reshaped plantation societies across the Americas. That's important to know.
Yeah.
So one of the most common staples was yams. So why don't we look at that? This was without question one of the most common staples fed to enslaved people aboard ships. Slave merchant John Barbot, for example, noted that for a ship carrying 500 enslaved Africans, more than 100,000 yams, yes, that's 200 per person, were needed for the journey. And they weren't the only ones relying on yams. Ship logs like those of the Elizabeth in 1754 listed provisions of yams alongside plantains, rice, fish, and cornbread. The Othello's records from 1768 to 69 mention hundreds of baskets of yams loaded alongside plantains, limes, and peanuts. One enslaved African who survived the voyage to Charleston recalled, let's hear it, "We had nothing to eat but yams, which were thrown amongst us at random, and of those we had scarcely enough to support life. More than a third of us died on the passage, and when we arrived at Charleston, I was not able to stand." Wow. That's very impactful. But even now, even in this unimaginable suffering, the cultural legacy of African crops endured. Yams, which are similar to the American sweet potato, became a cornerstone of Southern cuisine. To this day, dishes like roasted and sugared yams or sweet potato pie trace their roots back to the African slavery. And it wasn't just yams, though, John. Take the kola nut, for example. Slave voyages most certainly contributed to the presence of the kola nut in the New World plantation societies. So in Africa, the kola nut held deep cultural and medicinal significance. On slave ships, it was often given to newly arrived Africans, reported as a stimulant or even a way to improve the taste of bad water. But its use didn't stop there. In the Americas, the kola nut became a part of the Afro-Caribbean identity. It's featured prominently in religious practices like the Afro-Brazilian candomblé, where it retained its role as both sacred and an object and a stimulant. But John, one of the most remarkable stories of adaptation and resistance from the transatlantic slave trade is the role of seeds. Imagine this: enslaved Africans hiding seeds in their hair. Just small, unassuming, yet profoundly powerful, though. These seeds tucked away during their forced journeys represented, survival, preservation, right? Or preservation and defiance. They carried the knowledge of their homeland and hope of sustaining it, even in the harshest of circumstances.
Yeah, it's like one of those quotes or sayings, the power of small things, right? And what's more powerful than this small seed that just holds your whole cultural identity and
Yeah.
home. But it wasn't just the seeds, right? So enslaved Africans also brought with them the expertise in tropical agriculture,
Yes.
knowledge that European plantation owners desperately needed. We talked about this, that knowledge was such an
100%.
important transfer from Africa to the Americas. And it's important to remember that many European immigrants to the Americas were tradespeople or town dwellers with just really little to no farming experience. I mean, we all know the story about the pilgrims that and the first Thanksgiving, they didn't know about farming. They weren't agriculturally adept beyond, maybe just getting by on some very basics. So to make things even more complicated, the crops that Europeans relied on, wheat, rye, barley, they just couldn't simply survive the heat and humidity of the tropics where a lot of these plantation societies were developing. So think, southern part of the United States, obviously the Caribbean, and then the northern part of South America. So they were just completely unprepared to cultivate food in these environments, and that's where the enslaved African people stepped in. So, unlike the Europeans, they were skilled in raising food in tropical climates. In fact, they adapted quickly by incorporating local crops like maize, manioc, which again, ironically, are from America, but
And
they
there's
had that.
maize again.
Yeah, but again, they had the experience of cultivating it back in Africa because it wasn't the Europeans that were cultivating these crops they're bringing from America. They were being cultivated by the African people, and so they were familiar with that and how it operated within their agricultural systems. But didn't stop there. They also introduced African dietary staples to plantation food fields. So a good example of this is the taro. And Richard Ligon, who lived in the Barbados during its early days as a sugar colony, credited the enslaved Africans with introducing this essential crop. And he wrote, "There is a root of which some of the Negroes brought the seeds and planted there, and they grew." And he goes on, he mentions the plant's large size, that both the tuber and the leaves were prepared as food, the tuber's suitability as provision for lengthy sea voyages. And so, based on his whole description there, we can likely assume that he's talking about the taro. And it wouldn't be a surprise because this was a frequent staple of the Middle Passage crossings. And the enslaved Africans likely instigated the tubers cultivation with rootstock they brought from the slave ship, basically tubers that remained from the slave ship voyage that carried them to the Barbados. But here's the tragedy again. So enslaved Africans were made entirely responsible for their own food production. The burden was just added to this brutal labor regime of sugarcane cultivation, leaving little time, little energy for subsistence farming. And plantation owners saw this as convenient. First, they knew little about growing food, like we just talked about. They have no idea what they're really doing. They're just there to force people to do it so they can make money off of them. And it absolved the plantation owners from the responsibility of feeding their workforce. So from their perspective, it was just another way to maximize profits. Yet, even through this meant an intensification of their labor burden. So even though this meant that the Africans were going to have to do even more and spend even more of their energy and time, the enslaved people fought for the right to an independent subsistence plot. But why? Why on earth would these people that are just being completely abused physically, mentally, want to spend even more time growing their own food? Because those plots represented more than just a means to grow food. They offered a sliver of autonomy. It was a chance to grow crops without supervision, to produce surpluses that they could market and even earn petty cash from. So for many, these plots were a rare opportunity to take some control over their lives, to secure a measure of economic independence, strengthen their subsistence security, and to preserve some sense of dignity. So when we think about survival in the brutal conditions of slavery, it's hard to imagine the ingenuity it took to make something out of nothing. So while they were given these plots, they were often given the most marginal and degraded lands. Of course, right? Of course, that's what these owners are going to do. So what did those plots look like? So they were usually places with poor drainage, rocky soil, steep slopes prone to erosion. Not exactly what you call perfect or prime farmland. But again, against all odds, these these enslaved Africans turned these inhospitable areas into thriving plots of subsistence, and they did so using again that deep knowledge as tropical farmers from their home. And so they would stabilize eroded slopes by ridging the lands with hoes. They created terraces that reduced soil loss, improved water retention, and they chose crops that didn't necessarily need constant care but could still produce abundantly. So root crops, again, yams, taro, plantains, these were ideal crops that could fit in that model. And these staples could thrive in these difficult conditions. Then you had legumes like pigeon peas that pulled double duty, right? They fed people and animals. It enriched the soil and even served as a boundary markers for these plots. So these small plots became more than just food gardens. They were some kind of coined it these informal experimental stations, basic places where African crops and agricultural techniques were transferred, adapted, and preserved. And in many ways, they were the botanical gardens of the dispossessed, maintaining this living connection to African agricultural heritage. And this legacy didn't stop at the end of slavery. Okay. One incredible example of its contribution is the story of George Washington Carver. And this is a story we'll actually be sharing in the episodes following this one. It's going to be a two-part series. So I'm not going to give away too much, but this is a man who was born into slavery in Missouri and then went on to revolutionize agriculture in the US. And so his scientific work actually focused on crops like okra, black-eyed peas, and peanuts, staples of these very gardens that we're talking about right now, these subsistence gardens that were tended by enslaved Africans. So again, you're going to see these threads that connect all the way to today from this period in history.
And it's amazing too, and I'm really looking forward to that one too. John is such an iconic person in American history. Now, John, we've talked about the physical and emotional marks that the slave trade has left, but there's actually a more subtle yet equally powerful way the transatlantic slave trade left the mark. Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
And so am I, right? So, and that's through toponyms. So place names used to identify crops. These names often reflect the African origins of the plants enslaved people brought with them or cultivated in the Americas. So take Guinea, for example. During the transatlantic slave trade, Europeans referred to much of the West Africa as Guinea. So, and this is Guinea, okay? And they used the term to label crops that were unfamiliar to them, but common in African agriculture. Sorghum, for instance, became known in English as Guinea corn. Okay, so we've got corn again, John. Yeah. It's coming up.
I was there.
Yeah. Similarly, the pigeon pea was often called the Congo pea or Angola pea, referencing regions of Africa central to the trade. Now, it wasn't just English speakers doing this. In Spanish, for example, bananas and plantains were both initially called plátanos, but in Spanish America, they started to differentiate between the two. The sweeter the banana was called plátano guineo, literally Guinea plantain, a nod to its African origins. That name stuck and evolved today in places like Eastern Cuba, Colombia's Caribbean coast, Ecuador's Pacific lowlands, and El Salvador. Bananas are still known simply as guineos. That's cool, man. I like that. Yeah. Shows a little bit of history. So these names weren't random. They reflected a deliberate effort by European traders to catalog and classify the crops that fed the enslaved people on the horrific journeys that they had to endure. The plants themselves, like sorghum and pigeon peas, were often part of the provisions loaded onto slave ships. These crops were critical to sustaining captives during the Middle Passage and later became staples in plantation diets. Now, what's remarkable, everyone, is that the linguistics mapping underscores the deep connection between African agriculture and the food systems of the Americas. These crops and the names they carry are living testaments of the resilience, or to the resilience, of African agriculture and traditions, and very pivotal. They played a very, very, very pivotal role in the history of the Atlantic world. Now, it's a legacy that reminds us how much of the Columbian exchange, particularly in terms of food, was shaped by the force of movement of the people and the deliberate transplantation of their agricultural knowledge, John. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So each of these toponyms carries with it a story of adaptation, survival, and cultural exchange under the most harrowing circumstances.
Yeah, it's definitely
Wow.
it's a again,
Wow.
linguistics is always an interesting area to look at as well because you don't
Yeah.
think about the words you use every day, but there's a history behind even that.
Every
And
word, yeah, 100%, right? That's why we have linguistics, right? To understand the meanings and understand these words and how they were
evolved
brought
and
about. Yeah, how they were brought about and then how they evolved. I love that.
yeah.
John finishes my sentences.
That's what happens when we talk too much,
We
right?
talk way too
But
much.
but let's quickly look at the peanut because it's really one of those crops that touches on everything we've really discussed so far. It's a good case
Can
study.
I jump in and say also the peanut president that we just did? Okay.
All right. I know the peanut is going to be making a surprisingly a lot of appearances, I feel like, in 2025 for us here. So
Real quick, before you go on, I was at Podfest just over a month ago, and it's so funny because one of the people there, they call me the fruits and nuts guy. That's
Oh,
what they calls me. And I
fruits and
said,
nuts. All right.
I've only had one nut on my show,
We're gonna have a lot more nuts coming.
and that was Stephanie Stuckey with the pecans. But
Oh, that's
it's
right.
so true because nuts are part of the ag world and played a very important role.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are going to be a lot more nuts, but peanuts. So most of us associate peanuts with Southern cooking, maybe even baseball games, the iconic American sport. But their story actually begins thousands of years ago in tropical eastern Bolivia. And I'm not going to go through the whole history of peanuts here. We're probably going to do an episode actually on that later this year. But some important things here. The peanut was domesticated by Amerindian societies and was already being cultivated in parts of the Caribbean by the time Columbus arrived. And the Arawak Indians of the Antilles actually called it mani, a name that the Spanish colonizers adopted. And the Portuguese, on the other hand, encountered peanuts in Brazil and borrowed the Tupi term mandubi, which eventually became the modern Portuguese let's see here, amendoim. But the peanuts journey didn't stop there. So Portuguese caravels carried it across the Atlantic. So again, one of these transfers of crops from Americas to Africa, and they brought it to West Africa in the 16th century, where it was again rapidly adopted into the local agricultural systems like maize and these other foods that we've been talking about. Now, interestingly, Africans didn't use the New World names for the peanut. Instead, they gave it vernacular names like gobo gobo or variations inspired by their knowledge of the Bambara groundnut. So over time, these names evolved into terms like nguba and mpinda, which eventually made their way into English as goober and pindar. So peanuts were really an ideal food again for the transatlantic voyages. Peanuts are obviously protected by their shell. They can survive long sea journeys without spoiling. And so, again, this is another example of a crop that made it aboard slave ships as a staple, and eventually became this essential source of nutrition for the enslaved Africans during this brutal trip on the Middle Passage. And they're versatile too. They could be eaten raw, they could be roasted, boiled, and used in stews. But again, the story doesn't end there. When the enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them the knowledge. Again, even though this came originally from America, it was quickly adopted into their system. They knew how this plant worked, they knew how to use it, and they brought that with them to the Americans. So plantation owners first encountered actually the peanuts in these subsistence gardens of enslaved people, so much so that a lot of Europeans thought actually that it was an African plant because they saw so many of the enslaved Africans using it. So they quickly realized, these plantation owners, the commercial potential of peanuts, learning, of course, how to cultivate them and use them from those they enslaved. But here's the irony: in the South, peanuts were initially dismissed as slave food, much like the potato was, right? Scorned as Irish food in the 17th century Ireland, or the plantain was looked down upon by Caribbean planters. So this so-called slave food actually eventually transformed into a cornerstone of Southern agriculture and cuisine. And for enslaved Africans, peanuts were more than just sustenance. They were a critical source of protein in a diet that was dominated by starches. And so their familiarity with the Bambara groundnut back in Africa had already encouraged them to experiment with peanuts when they first arrived on their continent. And that same knowledge informed how they consumed and cultivated the peanut in the Americans. And like I said, we'll be talking a lot more about peanuts in episodes to come. Actually, even in some of the more immediate episodes to come. So stay tuned for more peanuts. But Patrick, we've traced the journey of African crops from their origins through the transatlantic slave trade and
Yes.
into now the plantations of the Americas. Now, let's talk about what this all means today, because the story doesn't end with the survival, right? It continues in the ways African agriculture traditions have shaped cuisines, economies, and identities really all across the world.
Yeah, 100%. And when you said that, it's like pull Austin Powers. What does it all mean, Basil? Like, it's true though, and you're exactly right, John. African crops didn't take root in new lands; they transformed them. Okay. Today, crops like okra, black-eyed peas, rice, millet, and yams are foundational to cuisines throughout the Americas. From the low country of Gola cuisine of the Carolinas to Brazilian feijoada, West African flavors remain alive in the food traditions of the African diaspora. And we did see that, John, in High on the Hog. We saw so many dishes that were brought to life that were old recipes. And, there's a lady in there named Dr. J that, she is a culinary anthropologist that talks about a lot of these cuisines and how they came about. And that was just so impactful to see. And I'm bringing that up over and over again because that's insane. Okay. And then, of course, there are the widely known consumer products like, John, we already know, Coca-Cola, Palmolive soap, Worcestershire sauce, red zinger tea, Snapple that rely on part of plants to domesticate in Africa. So it's all coming together. But beyond the plants and products themselves, the people whose ancestors are connected to these crops and their knowledge have also lived on. Today, there's a growing movement to reclaim and celebrate African foodways, whether it's through heirloom seed preservation, culinary heritage projects, or efforts to recognize the contributions of Black farmers in shaping global ag. Africa's crops and food traditions didn't just survive the horrors of the transatlantic trade, John. They thrived, evolving into new forms while still carrying their deep cultural roots, my friend.
Yeah. And it's really a powerful reminder, right? And with something we've preached a lot
100%
since the beginning is food is history.
Oh my gosh. Like, people don't understand. Like, again, what do we always say? Wars start over food
and
water and love.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. I mean, it's so true. And I know this is like, you guys, and I want to bring this to like because we always bring up like the Trojan horse and all these different things that was love, right? Different trade wars we've had. But even like, I watched a movie the other day and it was the new Mad Max movie. And the whole purpose of that was they needed abundance, right?
So they were supposed to be like barren land or something, right?
You're in the wasteland of Australia. And so it was about abundance. They wanted to find things of abundance, of greenery, of water, because if you controlled the water, controlled the food, controlled these things, then you were technically king, even if you weren't trying to be, right?
Yeah.
And those were things that were brought about, right? Having mother's milk, right? It was hard to get these things because in a world of even, thousands of years ago, and even to a fictional movie, right? There's still things that they focus on that show. If you don't have it, someone wants it. And if you have it, someone's going to try and take it from you.
Yeah. 100%.
Yep.
Food and water. But
food and water, baby.
But we
and love.
And love, of course. Cannot forget the love. But no, we hoped you learned something new on this topic of the transatlantic slave trade and, of course, African crops. And when we return, we'll be kicking off a 2-part series, like I mentioned, on the life of George Washington Carver as we continue to celebrate Black History Month here on the History of Fresh Produce. And, of course, if you want to hear more in bonus episodes or get early access to those upcoming episodes, you know what to do at this point. Sign up to the History of Fresh Produce Club, and you can see all the wonderful benefits you can realize by joining that club. But that's all for us today. So until next time, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And goodbye for me, Patrick Kelly. And as always, everyone, please send us your thoughts, your comments as we do research after research. And I know sometimes that you might be thinking, well, I didn't hear it that way. We want to hear your comments. We want to hear those concerns. We want to hear what we can then bring up on another episode, right, John? So 100%, we'll see you next time.